In the late 11th century, the map of power was shifting underfoot. For generations, the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, had stood as Europe's armor, its armies garrisoned across Anatolia and its fleets guarding the straits to the Black Sea. Then, in 1071, it suffered a blow so sudden that the empire reeled as if struck in the temple. On a dusty field near Lake Van, the Byzantine army met the Seljuk Turks at Manzikert. Confusion, treachery, and nimble horse archers shattered the imperial lines. The Emperor Romanos IV was captured. The men who survived fled west, and behind them, the heartland of Anatolia, Byzantium's great reservoir of grain, taxes, and soldiers, began to slip away like sand. The consequences rippled far beyond the battlefield. Anatolia was the empire's fortress farm, the soil from which its peasant soldiers and tax revenues grew. Lose Anatolia, and Constantinople would live thereafter on nerve and memory. Turkish warbands rode deep into the plateau. Cities that had sworn to the emperor now paid tribute to sultans. In the capital, factions clawed at the remains of authority as emperors rose and fell in quick succession. Villages once drilled in the emperor's name now lit their lamps for new lords. Byzantium was not finished, but it had begun to drown. Into this crisis stepped Alexios I Komnenos, a hard, pragmatic soldier with a statesman's instincts. Crowned in 1081, he stabilized the capital and fought fire on every frontier: Normans in the west, Pechenegs and Cumans in the north, and the Seljuks in the east. He needed time, money, and men. More than anything, he needed knights, armored cavalry that could meet Turkish horsemen blow for blow. Byzantium had long hired Western mercenaries, but the scale of the problem had outgrown mere contracts. Alexios drafted letters and sent envoys across the Adriatic, making a bold request to the Bishop of Rome: send warriors to help the Christians of the East push back the Turks and recover Anatolia. The Pope who received those appeals, Urban II, had his own storm to calm. The 11th century was an age of reform and tension in the Latin Church, struggles over simony, clerical marriage, and the independence of the papacy from secular kings. Knights, meanwhile, were a social problem with swords, trained for violence, hungry for honor, often turning their skill against peasants and one another. The Peace and Truce of God movements tried to restrain them, to sanctify certain days and protect the innocent, but blood still slicked Europe's fields. Urban saw in Alexios's plea not only a chance to aid fellow Christians, but to redirect the warrior energy of the West toward a higher purpose, and to bind Christendom, however briefly, under a single, transcendent mission. There were deeper currents. In 1054, Rome and Constantinople had famously clashed in the Great Schism, trading excommunications that formalized centuries of drift between Latin West and Greek East. And yet, despite theological wounds, Alexios and Urban now groped toward a practical alliance. The emperor wanted disciplined contingents he could integrate and control. The Pope envisioned something larger, an armed pilgrimage whose reward was spiritual, not feudal. In March 1095 at Piacenza, Byzantine envoys publicly described the empire's peril and begged for help. Urban listened. Later that year, he traveled to the Auvergne, to a town called Clermont, and preached an idea that had never been spoken so boldly: take up the cross, march east as pilgrims bearing arms, and receive the remission of sins. It was an extraordinary innovation, a plenary indulgence offered not for cloistered penance but for a journey of steel and dust. According to chroniclers, the crowd answered with a roar. God wills it. Men and women wept. Some tore cloth to sew crosses onto their garments on the spot. Word rippled outward along monastery roads and market lanes, carried by preachers to town squares and parish churches, translated into the languages of France, Lithuania, the Rhineland, and beyond. Why did it resonate so quickly? Faith, yes, and fear of judgment. Medieval people lived with death at their elbow. Famine, disease, and war stitched suffering into daily life. The promise that a perilous pilgrimage could cleanse the ledger of sin struck the soul like a bell. But there were worldly motives braided in the call. Europe's population was growing. Sons without inheritances looked for lands where their names might matter. Italian ports smelled opportunity in Eastern trade. Lords imagined new principalities in places they had only read about in Scripture. Some sought atonement, some sought adventure, some sought both with equal fervor. To reduce the crusade to greed is to miss the zeal. To reduce it to pure piety is to ignore the heavy purse. Urban's message also crafted a new identity for the warrior. Knights would no longer be merely brutal masters of local valleys. They could become milits Christi, soldiers of Christ, bound by vow and marked by the cross. Violence, properly channeled, could be penitential. The pilgrimage would not be a mercenary expedition in imperial pay, but a movement of many peoples under a spiritual banner to be coordinated with, but not owned by, the Byzantine emperor. Alexios did not ask for a tidal wave, but that is what arrived. In the spring and summer of 1096, before the great lords could even gather, a rough-edged host began to move. The People's Crusade, peasants, small knights and zealots swept up by charismatic preachers. Behind them, in better order, mustered the great princes: Raymond of St. Gilles from Toulouse, Godfrey of Bouillon from Lotharingia, Bohemond of Taranto and his Norman kin, Robert of Normandy and others, each with their own retinues, banners, and agendas. They would travel by different routes, converging on Constantinople like rivers on a sea, bringing with them languages that few Byzantines understood, customs that looked barbaric to the seasoned diplomats of the Bosporus, and a fervor that made negotiation delicate. For all the talk of unity, the enterprise contained a fault line that would never fully close. The emperor sought oaths. Lands recovered from the Turks were, in his view, imperial territories to be returned. The princes, proud and suspicious, weighed honor against advantage, and some swore grudgingly. Mutual contempt simmered under the smiles. To the Latins, Constantinople's court glittered with silks and eunuchs. Thick with intrigues, they mocked as effeminate. To the Byzantines, these western giants were iron-clad children. Brave, yes, but rough, undisciplined, and dangerously ignorant of strategy or supply. And yet for a time their interests aligned. The road ahead promised deserts and sieges, hunger and plague, arguments in tents and miracles at dawn. But the hinge that set the door turning was here. Defeat at Manzikert, a plea from an emperor, a pope's audacious theology, and a Europe ready to march for both heaven and earth. From Clermont's hilltops, where Urban's voice faded into winter air, the crusade began to move, not as a single army, but as a great tide of vows, each cross stitched by a human hand, each step carrying the West toward Nicaea, Antioch, and a city that had haunted Christian prayers for 1,000 years. Jerusalem. Before the great princes finished mustering their riders and wagons, the first wave was already on the road, impatient, poor, and aflame with promise. Chroniclers would call it the People's Crusade, and it moved not like an army but like a flood. Peasants and craftsmen, small knights and camp followers, wives with children in their arms, men who had never seen the sea and now swore to walk beyond it. They stitched crosses onto tunics at kitchen tables and in church porches, packed bread and hope, and followed a handful of charismatic leaders toward a horizon they could not imagine. The most famous of these leaders was a small, wiry preacher named Peter the Hermit. Barefoot, dressed in rough wool, riding a little donkey, Peter spoke with a heat that made crowds weep. He promised that those who suffered would be forgiven, that the road itself would be God's ladder to heaven. Another was Walter Sands of War, Walter the Penniless, a minor knight who became, almost by accident, a captain of the desperate. Behind them trailed bands from the Rhineland, from Flanders and Lotharingia, from the valleys of the Seine and the Loire. Few had money, fewer had discipline, but almost all had conviction. Conviction, however, does not feed mouths. As the columns crossed into the lands of the Kingdom of Hungary and then into Byzantine territory, their numbers strained markets and patience. Some paid, many took. Fights with locals flared, barns were raided, towns sealed their gates in fear. The People's Crusade had no central commissariat, no chain of command, no treasury. It marched on enthusiasm and whatever it could seize. Along the Rhine, another, darker current ran with these pilgrim tides. A German count named Emicho gathered a band that turned its zeal upon the Jews of the Rhineland, massacring communities in Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. Some bishops tried to shelter their flock. Some failed. Some did not try at all. The dead of those spring days do not appear on Crusader rolls, yet they mark the story with blood. It is a reminder that the crusade was never one thing. It was 1,000 motives braided into a banner, piety and plunder, charity and cruelty, side by side. By the time the first masses reached the edge of Byzantine lands, Emperor Alexios, I understood he faced not an expeditionary force but a humanitarian emergency with swords. He had asked the Pope for trained contingents to help reclaim Anatolia. Instead, uncounted thousands were now milling outside his cities. Alexios did what he did best. He improvised. He fed them as he could, shepherded them along the imperial roads with escorts, and hurried them quickly across the Bosporus. Better to move this tinderbox out of Thrace than let it ignite in his own granaries. On the Asian shore, the realities of crusading hit like a stone. Before them stretched Anatolia, a plateau of sun-burned grass and thorn, dotted with towns now loyal to Seljuk sultans. Somewhere beyond lay Nicaea, the Turkish capital, and farther still the road to Antioch and Jerusalem. But the People's Crusade had no siege engines, few horses, and not enough food. Scouts drifted away. Commanders bickered. Peter the Hermit harangued and prayed, but prayer does not conjure grain. They split. Some small bands ranged ahead and were cut down. A larger detachment, lured by rumors of easy plunder, seized a hill fort called Zarigordon, only to find themselves surrounded by the Seljuk Sultan Kilij Arslan's troops. The Seljuks cut the wells and sat in the heat while thirst did the work. A few weeks later, the defenders surrendered or died. Those who survived were enslaved or forced to convert. The People's Crusade had met the first cool calculation of professional war, and it was not equal to it. Back at the main camp near Sivtot, the rest of the Crusaders, ignorant of Zarigordon's fall, argued over their next move. Some insisted they should wait for the princes. Others, intoxicated by numbers, believed God would multiply their strength the way he had multiplied loaves. In late October 1096, they chose, fatally, to march out in a mass toward Nicaea, hoping to surprise the enemy. They did not. The Seljuk vanguard found them in a wooded valley and fell upon them in a storm of arrows. Panic spread. Men broke for the river. Women and children were trampled in the crush. Only a small corps of better armed knights formed a hedgehog of shields and tried to fight through. By sunset, the valley was quiet, save for the work of scavengers. A few thousand survivors scrambled back to Sivtot, where a Byzantine flotilla plucked them from the shore. Peter the Hermit, who had left earlier to negotiate supplies in Constantinople, returned to find his congregation scattered like birds after a hawk's strike. The People's Crusade was over. In less than 6 months, the first wave had marched to Asia and been broken there, leaving behind graves without names and a lesson that would haunt every commander who came after. Zeal is not a strategy. Yet even in failure, the People's Crusade reshaped the ground the princes would tread. Alexios had seen what unregulated pilgrimage could do. Henceforth, he would insist on oaths and order when the great lords arrived. Kilij Arslan, for his part, learned to underestimate Westerners, a mistake he would pay for the following summer when the armored fist of the First Crusade finally crossed the straits. And Europe, hearing garbled news carried back along the roads, did not turn away. If anything, tales of disaster hardened resolve. The people had gone first and fallen. Now the princes would come. It is tempting to dismiss this beginning as a preface by amateurs to a story written by professionals. But the People's Crusade reveals the first truth of crusading. It was never only a campaign waged by kings. It was a movement that seized ordinary lives. Men sold plows. Women packed loaves and led children by the hand. Villages emptied, not for profit but for promise. That such promise could end in starvation, and slaughter did not make it less real. The road to Jerusalem was not paved by strategy alone. It was paved by hope. Alexios allowed the survivors to winter in imperial lands under supervision, then folded some into the contingents of the leaders now arriving. Peter the Hermit would continue on as a preacher attached to larger armies, his voice still able to make men feel that the dust on their boots was holy. Walter the Penniless was dead, cut down in Anatolia, but his memory lingered as a tale told around fires, a poor knight who tried to lead the poor to God and met the world instead. When in the spring of 1097 banners finally rose over disciplined camps, Raymond's Cross of Toulouse, Godfrey's Lorrainer standard, the Norman Boar of Bohemond, those leaders found the Bosporus guarded, the emperor waiting, and a new policy in place. They would be ferried across in stages, supplied by Byzantine ships, and aimed first not at Jerusalem but at the near prize, Nicaea. The First Crusade, in the form history remembers, was at last beginning. It would bring sieges that bit through hunger and heat, battles decided by minutes and by miracles, betrayals and bargains, and a march that would end, unbelievably, in the streets of Jerusalem. But its opening act had already given the tale its texture, faith and folly walking side by side. When the armies of the princes finally appeared before Constantinople in spring 1097, the city glittered like a miracle to men who had ridden months through mud and hunger. Marble quays, domes layered like seashells, markets stacked with spices and silk. This was the wealth of the East they had only imagined. But behind the splendor stood an emperor with a ledger. Alexios I Komnenos received each leader in turn: Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, Robert of Normandy, Robert of Flanders, feeding their men, weighing their character, and extracting what he required. Oaths that lands recovered from the Turks would be returned to the empire. The princes grumbled, sworn as they were to honor and to appetite, but most agreed. Then, ferried by Byzantine ships, the crusading host crossed the Bosporus into Asia. The real work began. Their first target rose white-walled and stubborn: Nicaea, capital of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. The Crusaders ringed it with campfires and engines, battering towers and tunneling beneath the foundations, while Byzantine galleys, dragged overland to the lake behind the city, cut off supply and hope. After weeks of siege, the banners that went up on the ramparts were not the Crusaders' crosses but the double-headed eagles of Byzantium. Alexios had negotiated a quiet surrender through the garrison's leaders, sparing the city from sack and folding it back into imperial hands. The princes received gifts and pay but not loot. Pride smarted. The alliance endured, yet suspicion took root. Soon they pushed inland along the stony roads of Anatolia. The summer sun beat down. Water was a prize, shade an answered prayer. Near Dorylaeum in July 1097, Kilij Arslan struck, his horse archers howling through dust, arrows falling like rain on Bohemond's exposed vanguard. Panic rippled, baggage animals scattered. Then through the haze the rest of the army arrived: Godfrey, Raymond, and the northern French, charging in layered formations that turned the field. Heavy cavalry crashed into the Seljuk lines, spears leveled, shields locked, while the infantry formed hedgehogs against encircling fire. By day's end, the Turks withdrew. On that sun-scorched plain, the West learned it could survive the desert's ambush. The Seljuks learned that iron men could not be brushed aside. The march became a test of will. Men died of thirst, horses starved, discipline thinned. Yet the army threaded the spine of Asia Minor through Iconium and Heraclea and down into Cilicia. There an episode altered the course of the crusade. Baldwin of Boulogne, Godfrey's brother, detached with a smaller force, drifting east along the Euphrates. In the Armenian city of Edessa he found an opening. Invited first as an ally by the ruler Thoros, then adopted as his heir, Baldwin emerged, after Thoros' suspicious death, as the new lord. In 1098, the first Crusader state was born, the county of Edessa, a frontier bastion that would both support and complicate the road to Jerusalem. The main host, meanwhile, converged on the fortress city that barred Syria, Antioch. Its walls, studded with towers, sprawled for miles along hills and river. In October 1097, the Crusaders encircled it, and a long siege began. Rain, hunger, and fevers their constant companions. Supplies trickled from St. Simeon's Port, raiding parties probed, men died in ditches for scraps of bread. Within the camp, tempers flared and reputations frayed. Stephen of Blois, a great lord from France, lost heart and slipped away, later telling Emperor Alexios, hurrying to aid them, that all was lost. In winter's depth, horseflesh went to the cookfires, leather boiled into soup. Still the city would not fall. The crack, when it came, was human. Bohemond, Norman prince and opportunist, opened a secret channel to a tower captain named Furras, who commanded a stretch of wall on Mount Silpius. Promises were made. A ladder rose in darkness. A gate swung wide. On the night of June 23, 1098, Crusaders swarmed inside, cutting down guards and throwing open more gates as panicked defenders fled. Antioch at last was theirs. Triumph lasted hours. Almost immediately, the great Atabeg Kerbogha of Mosul appeared with a relieving army, encircling the city and flipping the siege. Now the Crusaders were the ones trapped, ragged, exhausted, quarreling over the very prize they might soon lose. It was then that a vision gripped the camp. A Provençal priest named Peter Bartholomew declared that God had revealed to him the location of the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ's side, buried beneath the floor of the Cathedral of St. Peter. Digging in torchlight, men turned up an iron point. Was it planted? Was it providence? Belief fed hunger. With the relic borne aloft, the army marched out in ordered divisions on June 28, 1098. Kerbogha's great coalition, stitched together by prestige and rivalry, unraveled under pressure. As the Crusaders advanced with banners high and hymns rolling like thunder, his allies peeled away, each fearing another's gain. The Christians struck, not as a mob but as a drilled line, and the Atabeg's army broke. Antioch was saved. So too was Bohemond's ambition. He claimed the city for himself, arguing that Alexios had failed to relieve them. He had turned back after meeting Stephen of Blois. The oath to return conquests to Byzantium tangled in insult and self-interest. The breach with the empire widened. Months passed before the leaders could agree to move south. Some lords wintered, some raided, some argued over Antioch's fate. The road to Jerusalem reopened in early 1099, the army now a leaner spear, perhaps 12,000 fighting men from an original host many times larger. Coastal emirs, pragmatic, offered guides and provisions rather than battle. Others paid tribute to avoid sieges they could not win. Outside Tripoli, a great cedar was felled and a promise given. At Beirut, envoys bartered. The Crusaders marched through a chessboard of truces and threats until, at last, the city of their prayers rose on the hills, Jerusalem. It was June, and the city, recently retaken by the Fatimid Egyptians, bristled with defenders. Water was scarce. The surrounding countryside had been stripped of grain and wood. The Crusaders lacked siege engines. Their first assaults broke against the walls like surf. Then fortune shifted. Genoese mariners landed at Jaffa and hauled ship timber inland. Forests from the hills of Samaria were cut and dragged. Carpenters and smiths labored day and night, building towers, rams, and mantlets. Priests led barefoot processions around the city's circuit, chanting psalms, while on the walls imams answered with call and taunt. On July 14, the towers rolled forward, great wooden castles creaking on wheels. Arrows and stones rained from both sides, pitch and fire splashed, men died by the dozens on ladders and parapets. Count Raymond's engine battered the southern walls near Mount Zion. Godfrey's tower, moved at the last moment to a weaker stretch in the north, bridged the battlements at dawn on July 15. Flemish and Lorrainer knights crossed, cut down the defenders, and threw open a gate. The Crusaders poured in. What followed was slaughter. Chroniclers, Christian and Muslim, agree that many inhabitants were killed, Muslims in their quarters and Jews in their synagogues. In the blood and smoke, some knights cast aside helmets and knelt weeping at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The contradiction was not lost on witnesses. Mercy and massacre, prayer and pillage in the same streets. Within days, the leaders faced a question: who would rule? Raymond of Toulouse refused a crown others would not give. Bohemond was in Antioch. The choice fell upon Godfrey of Bouillon. He declined to be king in the city where Christ had worn a crown of thorns, styling himself instead advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. It was a compromise between piety and power, and a sign that the crusade had turned into states. One test remained. In August 1099, an Egyptian field army advanced from Ascalon to crush the new order. Godfrey marched to meet it with a small, hardened force. On the coastal plain, in a sudden, decisive clash, the Crusaders broke the Fatimid lines, seized their camp, and scattered the enemy. Jerusalem, for now, would stand. By the end of 1099, the map had been redrawn. Antioch in the north, Edessa on the frontier, and Jerusalem in the south, three of the four Latin states had taken shape. Tripoli would follow. Between them lay Muslim powers divided by rivalries, and to the east, a Byzantine emperor both ally and adversary. The First Crusade had done what almost no one thought possible, marched from the heart of Europe to the Holy City and taken it. But it had also sown the seeds of future calamities, promises bent, alliances soured, the memory of a sack that would burn in more than one tradition. The pilgrim army was splintering into principalities. The era of the Crusader states, the Latin East, had begun. When the dust of 1099 settled and the hymns in Jerusalem faded, the crusade did not simply end. It hardened into places on the map. Pilgrim armies became princes and vows became titles of land. The Latin East, Outremer, the lands beyond the sea, took shape as four states. The Principality of Antioch in the north, the county of Edessa astride the Euphrates, the county of Tripoli along the Levanten coast, and at the center the kingdom of Jerusalem. From the start, survival meant ports. Baldwin I, crowned king in Bethlehem after Godfrey's death, understood that Jerusalem could not live on inland piety. The sea fed the state. Food, timber, iron, and pilgrims arrived on hulls from Pisa, Genoa, and Venice. So the kings fought for a string of harbors: Jaffa, Acre, 1104, Sidon, 1110, Beirut, 1110, and eventually Tyre, 1124, each victory negotiated with Italian fleets that demanded, and received, neighborhoods and privileges inside the walls. In Acre streets you could hear Tuscan and Ligurian hawkers bargaining beside Arabic and Armenian, Syriac and French. The economy of the holy places was trade as much as tithe. Outremer society was a frontier lattice rather than a solid block. Frankish lords, few in number, scattered their castles to control roads, springs, and passes, ruling over majority populations of Arabic-speaking Muslims and Eastern Christians, Armenians, Syriacs, Greeks. The law tried to order this complexity. The famous assizes of Jerusalem, customs written down over time, set rules for feudal obligations, inheritances, and the rights of townsmen. A Latin patriarch presided in the Holy Sepulchre, but native churches endured. Markets functioned under tax farmers who cared more for coin than creed. The daily texture of life mixed strangeness and contact. Westerners born in the East, the Poulains, grew up speaking some Arabic, wearing lighter fabrics and eating spiced foods that their fathers once sniffed at. Muslim and Christian physicians treated one another's patients. Craftsmen shared techniques. Truces allowed harvests and exchanges even when banners faced each other over frontier stones. Uzama ibn Munki, a Syrian noble and writer, left portraits of Frankish neighbors alternately brave, naive, courteous, and exasperating. This was not peace, but it was a lived pluralism, practical as a well. Yet nothing in Outremer was durable without walls. The Latins did not possess enough men to hold long frontiers in the open. They turned hills into fortresses and roads into chains. Castles rose where stone offered height and water could be stored. Montreal Schabec. In the Araba, 1115. Kerak looming above the Moabite plateau, Belvoir Kokhav over the Jordan Valley, and farther north under Tripoli, the volcanic bastion of Crac des Chevaliers. Their silhouettes defined the age. Curtain walls stepped up a slope, gatehouses with murder holes, cisterns sunk deep against siege, chapels for the garrisoned souls, stables for the horses that could decide a battle by a single sally. Some were royal, some baronial. Increasingly, the most formidable were entrusted to new powers in the Latin world, the military orders. The Hospitallers began as caregivers. Before the conquest of Jerusalem, a brotherhood maintained a hospital for pilgrims near the Holy Sepulchre. Recognized by the papacy in 1113, the Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem received lands, rents, and privileges from kings and lords across Christendom. With wealth came arms. By mid-century, the Hospitallers were a standing military force, garrisoning fortresses like Krak and, later, Markab on the Syrian coast, soldier monks who prayed the hours and manned the walls. A decade later, another brotherhood took shape, the Knights of the Temple, the Templars. Around 1119–1120, a small group of knights vowed to protect pilgrims on the roads. The king housed them on Jerusalem's Temple Mount, rechristened the Templum Salomonis, lending them a name that would echo for centuries. At the Council of Troyes, 1129, they received a rule and papal favor. Like the Hospitallers, they grew into a transcontinental institution with estates from Portugal to Poland, funneling income east to pay for horses, armor, and stone. These orders were unlike anything Byzantium or the Islamic world had seen. Disciplined, celibate, exempt from many local laws, owing allegiance directly to the Pope rather than to kings. They multiplied the military sinew of the Latin states and sometimes complicated their politics. Barons envied their wealth and independence. Kings needed them. Rivalry between Hospitallers and Templars could be as sharp as their mutual contempt for complacent nobles. A third order, the Teutonic Knights, would emerge later at Acre, 1190. But in the 12th century, the twin pillars of Hospitaller and Templar defined the castle frontier. The Latin East was not merely a chain of fortresses but a beating pilgrimage economy. Every spring, fleets disgorged thousands who came to walk the Via Dolorosa, to touch the stone of Calvary, to witness the holy fire ceremony at Easter in the Sepulchre. Inns bustled, guides flourished, relics acquired stories, petty thieves and pious donors found their opportunities. The kings of Jerusalem minted coins with crosses and Arabic legends to ease transactions in the markets of Tyre and Damascus alike. Sugar plantations and olive groves, vineyards and glassworks. Outremer became a workshop where Mediterranean crafts mingled with Levantan skill. Diplomacy was as essential as stone. The Muslim world of the early 1100s was not a monolith. Between Aleppo, Mosul, Damascus, and Cairo ran rivalries and ambitions. Latin lords exploited these splits, signing truces with one emir to raid another, trading access to ports for peace on the frontier. Baldwin I campaigned deep into the Sinai and the Red Sea. Baldwin II was captured and ransomed after fighting northern powers. Fulk of Anjou, who married Queen Melisende, fortified Transjordan against Egyptian sorties. The kingdom's strength often rested not on one great victory, but on 1,000 small bargains held together by force of will. Still strain showed. The nobility of the Latin East was a small club, and succession could set it at each other's throats. Antioch leaned towards Cilician Armenia, marrying and feuding by turns. Tripoli watched both Damascus and Homs. Jerusalem balanced barons from the north, the Ibelins, for instance, against newcomers from Europe. Byzantium lurked as both patron and rival. The Treaty of Duvall, 1108, compelled Bohemond to acknowledge imperial suzerainty over Antioch, at least on parchment. Later, John II Comnenos campaigned to enforce claims, and Manuel I played the statesman with a mailed hand, helping and humiliating in the same breath. The schism between Latin and Greek was not healed by common enemies. Pride answered pride and kept old wounds open. Beyond the human horizon, patience gathered into a storm. In the 1130s and 1140s, a new figure knit together northern Syria and Mesopotamia, Zengi, Adebeg of Mosul and Aleppo. He was ruthless, a breaker of trusts, feared by friend and foe, and he preached with opportunism and conviction the need to resist the Franks. Where earlier Muslim rulers had treated the Latin states as neighbors to be managed, Zengi treated them as intruders to be expelled. Fortresses on the Euphrates trembled as he advanced. Garrisons calculated their odds. Edessa was first on the anvil. Isolated beyond the Orontes and the Amanus Mountains, its population split between Armenians and Franks, the county was the most vulnerable of the Latin states. In late 1144, while Prince Raymond of Antioch watched anxiously and King Baldwin III was young, Zengi saw his moment. He drove on Edessa, battered its walls, and forced its defenders into the citadel. After a short siege, the city fell. The sack that followed stunned the Latin East. The oldest Crusader state had been erased in weeks. News galloped west in winter. In Rome, at Mainz, at Vézelay, preachers raised their voices, none louder than Bernard of Clairvaux, the austere Cistercian whose words bent kings. If Jerusalem was to stand, if Antioch and Tripoli were not to be carved apart, Europe would have to march again. Outremer could not save itself alone. The fortresses were strong, the orders disciplined, the ports busy. But a new generation of leaders had arisen in the Muslim world, men for whom unification was not a dream but a strategy. Zengi's son-in-law, Nur al-Din, would soon take up the cause with piety and steel. Behind him, a young Kurdish officer in Egyptian service would watch and learn a patient art of war. The Latin East had built a society, fragile, adaptable, stubborn. It had carved out states where no one expected them, laced the coast with fortresses, and created a mixed world in which a Frankish knight might buy spices in Arabic from a Christian merchant while a Muslim mason cut stone for a castle paid for by a French abbot. But Edessa's fall signaled that walls alone were not enough. The era of uneasy advantage was closing. The Second Crusade was about to begin, led not by counts but by kings. Edessa's fall in 1144 struck the Latin East like a hammer on glass. For the first time since 1099, a Crusader principality had vanished. Word galloped west and pulpits answered. No monk spoke louder than Bernard of Clairvaux, thin, intense, a voice like a silver blade. In fields at Vézelay in 1146, he preached before King Louis VII of France and Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine. Thousands tore cloth to stitch new crosses. North of the Alps he swayed crowds and rulers alike. At Speyer, Emperor Conrad III took the cross. Bernard even turned back would-be rioters who sought to attack Jews, insisting the Crusades' enemy lay far away. Europe, once again, was moving. For the first time, a crusade would be led by kings. It looked promising on parchment. 2 monarchs, 2 armies, 1 purpose. Reality began to fray the moment iron met road. The route ran, as before, through the Byzantine Empire, now under the deft and wary Manuel I Comnenos. Manuel had lived a lifetime balancing Latin ambition with imperial survival. He would aid the Crusaders, but on his terms. He fed and ferried, posted guides and guards, hastened them across the Bosporus as quickly as grace allowed. Behind polite receptions pulsed old mistrust. Western chronicles muttered about Greek treachery. Byzantine courtiers rolled their eyes at Latin impatience. The alliance was practical, not affectionate. Conrad marched first in autumn 1147, straight into the plateau of Anatolia with a large German army. The Turks did what they did best. They did not oblige him with a set battle. Instead, they shadowed the columns, scorched wells, and hit where the road narrowed. Near the old field of Dorylaeum, where the First Crusade had won its spurs, Conrad's men were ambushed and chewed apart, cavalry dragged into ravines while baggage shattered and discipline dissolved. By the time he limped back to Nicaea and took ship for Constantinople to recover, the flower of his army lay on the stones. Louis VII followed on a more southerly path in winter, the queen riding with him, brilliant and self-possessed, trailed by Aquitanian lords who loved her. The French faced the same schooling. In January 1148, as the army threaded the ridges near Mount Cadmus, the vanguard pushed on too fast, the rearguard lagged. The center, where the king marched on foot to share the burden, stalled on a shelf of rock. Turks poured arrows down the slopes. Panic surged. Pack animals plunged into the gullies. Men clawed for purchase on scree slick with fear. Louis scrambled up a boulder ringed by enemies and fought like a pilgrim knight in a chanson, sword flashing, until his guard cut a path and rallied the line. The army escaped, but with gutted ranks. When the French reached the coast at Italia in Pamphylia, ships were hired, too few, too late. The king and nobles sailed. Thousands of poor soldiers and camp followers were told to march along the coast. Many were killed or enslaved. By the time Conrad and Louis met again in the Holy Land in spring 1148, their crusade had been scissored by distance, hunger, and dust. Once in the kingdom of Jerusalem, the kings faced a simple question with no good answer: where to strike? Edessa was gone and far beyond practical reach. Antioch, under Raymond of Poitiers, Aliner's uncle, argued for a northern strategy against Aleppo, which might crack the Zengid hold on Syria. Louis reached Antioch briefly, and politics flared like summer lightning. Raymond wanted a campaign. Louis wanted pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Rumors and later legends embroidered the rift, painting Aliner as willful, Raymond as persuasive, Louis as stubborn and jealous. Whatever the truth of hearts, the royal party left for the south. At Acre in June 1148, the leaders held a council at Pomeria and chose a nearer target, Damascus. Choice seemed bold and to some insane. Damascus had often been a counterweight to Zengi's line. The kingdom of Jerusalem had traded with its markets and made truces with its emirs. But the city also raided Galilee and its orchards. The Ghu Macron letter 1E60, a green halo of gardens and canals, gave cover and supplies to any besieger. Take Damascus, the argument ran, and you protect Jerusalem's flank. Fail, and you push a wavering neighbor into the arms of your worst enemy. The die was cast. In late July, three converging armies, Jerusalem's host, Conrad's Germans, and Louis's French, appeared before Damascus's western gardens. At first the plan worked. The Crusaders crashed through orchards and irrigation ditches, seized outworks, and cut a rough path toward the walls. The next day, though, everything shifted. Whether for fear of being trapped among canals, or seduced by Damascene notables promising to betray eastern gates, or worst, because factions in the Latin camp schemed for who would own the city once it fell, the leadership moved the entire army to the northeast face of Damascus. It was a fatal blunder. The ground there favored the defenders. Water access was poor. The walls were stronger. Relief forces under Nur al-Din were on the march. Within 4 days of the first trumpet, the Crusaders' nerve broke. Supplies ran thin, confidence ran out, suspicion ran high. Each contingent blamed the others. Germans scowled at Franks, Franks at barons born in the east. Everyone cursed the decision to shift camps. Rumors flew that some lords had been bribed, others that the Byzantines had plotted, still others that God, offended by sin in the ranks, had withdrawn his hand. Whatever the rumor, the reality was retreat. The kings pulled back toward Galilee, leaving the orchards of Damascus littered with broken mantlets and broken hopes. The failure was total. Never had such power been gathered and spent so quickly with so little to show. The kings sailed home through a fog of embarrassment. Conrad tried a joint campaign with the Byzantines in the Balkans and shrugged it off. Louis lingered in the east, then returned to France with a marriage strained to breaking. Bernard, who had inflamed Europe with sermons, now wrote letters of self-reproach and explanations. God, he said, had chastised pride and impurity. The crusade had failed not because the cause was wrong, but because the people were unworthy. It was a theology that salved consciences and satisfied few. For the Latin East, the consequences were immediate and grim. Damascus, feeling the hot breath of crusader ambition, turned decisively toward the Zengids. In 1154, Nur al-Din, pious, severe, and patient, entered the city and united Aleppo and Damascus under one banner. With Syria consolidated, the strategic vice began to close. Nur al-Din cultivated the language of jihad, endowed madrasas, and presented his wars as both righteous and orderly, a contrast to the fractious Latins. He employed capable commanders, among them a stout Kurdish officer named Shirkuh, and Shirkuh's young nephew, quiet and keen-eyed. Yusuf ibn Ayyub, whom the West would call Saladin. The kingdom of Jerusalem did not collapse at once. It still had strong kings, Baldwin III and Amalric, who seized Ascalon in 1153 and probed Egypt when Cairo's Fatimid Caliphate sagged toward ruin. The military orders doubled down on fortress warfare. Cracked chevaliers rose to a terrifying elegance. Trade continued. Pilgrims kept coming. Treaties bought seasons of peace. Raids bought grain and glory. But the tide had turned. With Syria unified and Egypt tottering, the center of gravity tilted toward a single possibility: a leader who could weld Egypt's wealth to Syria's purpose. Nur al-Din sent Shirkuh south in a series of expeditions to decide Egypt's future. In their train rode the nephew who watched and learned. By 1169, that nephew, Saladin, was vizier in Cairo. 2 years later, he abolished the Fatimid Caliphate, restored Sunni allegiance, and when Nur al-Din died in 1174, began the work of claiming Syria as well. Within a decade, the world that the First Crusade had carved out would face a commander who used patience as a weapon, mercy as policy, and steel without hesitation. The Second Crusade had begun with kings and ended with excuses. It left the Latin East exposed and its enemies energized. In the distance, across the dust and years, a hill of black rock waited for a hot July day in 1187, where two armies would face each other amid smoke and thirst. The horns of Hattin would sound, and the fate of Jerusalem would be decided by a man the Crusaders barely knew and would never forget: Saladin. When the Second Crusade collapsed outside the orchards of Damascus, a new kind of patience began shaping the map. In Syria, Nur al-Din tightened his grip, preaching sober piety and disciplined jihad. In Egypt, the exhausted Fatimid Caliphate staggered, its palace intrigues masking bankruptcy and decay. Nur al-Din sent his general Shirkuh south to manage the crisis. With him rode a quiet, sharp-eyed nephew, Yusuf ibn Ayyub. The West would remember him by a single name: Saladin. In Cairo, Saladin learned fast. He balanced factions, reassured merchants, and built a base that was moral as well as military. In 1169, he became vizier. In 1171, he abolished the Fatimid regime, restored allegiance to the Sunni Abbasid Caliph, and began to rebuild Egypt's army and finances. Mosques and colleges rose, tax registers were cleaned, shipyards awakened on the Nile. He minted his legitimacy in coin and prayer as well as in steel. When Nur al-Din died in 1174, the chessboard cracked. Saladin moved quickly, taking Damascus with little blood, then working year by year on Aleppo and Mosul. He did not conquer the Sunni world overnight. He negotiated, married, threatened, and waited, preferring treaty today for opportunity tomorrow. By 1186, Aleppo acknowledged him. Mosul recognized him as overlord. Egypt and most of Syria now answered to one man. For the first time since the First Crusade, the Muslim Near East faced the Latin states not as rival emirates but as a single, purposeful power. The road to Hattin was not a straight march. There were defeats and checks along the way. In 1177, while Saladin raided toward the coast, a teenage king, Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, the leper, sprang an audacious trap near Montchesard, smashing Saladin's vanguard and sending his army reeling back across Sinai. Baldwin's courage, amplified by the sight of a boy king armored against a disease that would kill him, became legend. But disease does not negotiate, and politics can ruin even the brave. Baldwin's slow death opened a succession crisis. Factions formed around his sister Sibylla and her Poitevin husband Guy of Lusignan on one side, and around barons like Raymond III of Tripoli and the Ibelin family on the other. The military orders split in temperament as well as task. Hospitallers often pragmatic, Templars more eager for a fight under a hawkish master, Gerard de Ridefort. Truces came and went. Saladin did business with Jerusalem's kings when it suited him, keeping caravans moving and harvests safe while he finished the Syrian puzzle. But one lord would not be managed: Rainald of Chatillon, the blunt, cash-hungry baron of Ultra-Jourdain who ruled from the cliff forts of Carac and Montreal over the caravan routes linking Syria and Egypt. Rainald raided with theatrical malice. He once dragged ships overland to launch a pirate foray in the Red Sea, sending panicked reports racing toward Mecca and Medina. Worse, when a formal truce was in force in 1186–1187, Reynold attacked a large caravan that included members of Saladin's own household. Prisoners were taken, property seized. Saladin demanded justice. Reynold laughed. The casus belli wrote itself. In early 1187, Saladin called banners from every quarter: Egypt, Damascus, Aleppo, Jazira. Imams preached, drums sounded, and tents multiplied like a forest. He crossed the Jordan and began with a bait. His forces struck at Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee, capturing the town and besieging the citadel where Raymond of Tripoli's wife, Esheva, held out. The choice he offered Jerusalem's leaders was brutal: march across parched hills in July to rescue Tiberias, or sit tight on the well-watered plateau near Sephoria and let a provincial stronghold fall. A council met. Raymond, whose city was under attack, counseled restraint: hold the high ground in the springs, let Saladin exhaust himself. Tiberias could be retaken later. Gerard de Ridefort, the Templar master, argued the opposite: honor and necessity demanded relief. Waiting would confess weakness and invite further raids. King Guy of Lusignan, uncertain and pressured by faction, chose the road. On July 3, the host of Jerusalem, perhaps 1520,000, including knights, Turcopoles, and foot, moved east with inadequate water and worse luck. The march baked them. The sun scoured iron and skin alike. Turkish skirmishers harried the flanks, losing arrows and lighting grass fires whose smoke drove men to cough and stumble. Waterskins ran dry, discipline frayed, carts bogged, the line compressed. By afternoon, the army reached the twin volcanic knolls known as the Horns of Hattin and camped on a slope scorched to charcoal. Saladin's men ringed them in the dusk and fed the winds with smoke through the night. At dawn on July 4, the Crusader army tried to claw its way toward the lake at Tiberias. Hospitallers and Templars led desperate charges to open a path to water. Infantry staggered after them, choking on dust. Saladin's cavalry gave ground and returned, bending but not breaking, raiding the baggage and peppering the archers' screens until they shredded. The true cross, the most sacred relic of the kingdom, stood near the king beneath a canopy. Priests held it high, voices hoarse from prayer. Around it, the last tight squares of knights formed and reformed as the heat hollowed them out. By midday, the line buckled. Raymond of Tripoli forced a breakout on one wing and escaped with a portion of the cavalry. Elsewhere, formations collapsed into knots of men cut off from one another. The royal tent went down, standards fell, the last sally failed. The true cross was seized, a wound as much spiritual as military. King Guy was captured. So were Gerard de Ridefort and many nobles. Among the prisoners was Reynold of Chatillon. Saladin met the defeated king in his pavilion and offered him a cup of iced sherbet, a sign under custom of clemency. Guy drank and tried to pass the cup to Reynold. Saladin stopped him. "I did not give it to him," the Sultan said. He turned to Reynold and offered a choice he knew would not be taken: convert and live or refuse and die. Reynold answered as expected. Saladin drew his sword and struck him down himself. To Guy he showed courtesy. Kings were ransomed. Oath-breakers were judged. Hattin shattered the kingdom of Jerusalem's field army. With its mounted corps destroyed or captured, the skeleton of Outremer stood undefended. Saladin moved with practiced method. Town after town surrendered or fell: Tiberias, Acre, Nablus, Jaffa, Ascalon. The military orders suffered worst. Many Templars and Hospitallers captured at Hattin were executed in batches, grim repayment for years of relentless frontier war. Only Tyre, stiffened by the sudden arrival of Conrad of Montferrat, held out, its sea-girt walls and Genoese ships defying the new tide. Jerusalem remained. Balian of Ibelin, released on parole to evacuate his family, asked Saladin's leave to re-enter the city briefly. Upon arrival, the people begged him to stay and lead the defense. He broke his parole, writing to the Sultan to explain that necessity, not treachery, had compelled him. Saladin accepted the moral logic and prepared his engines. Inside the city were perhaps a few thousand defenders at most, many of them townsmen hastily knighted for the crisis, women and children filling sacks with stones for the walls. The siege began in September 1187. Mines crept under towers, mangonels hurled stones, assaults tested the weak points. After days of pounding, a breach opened near the northern wall at the Tower of David and the Damascus Gate. Balian knew what a taken city could mean. Memories of 1099 burned in every sermon and rumor. He asked for terms. The negotiation that followed is one of the Crusades' strangest and most human scenes. Saladin, whose reputation for measured mercy was already forming, set ransoms. 10 dinars for men, 5 for women, 1 for children. The poor would be freed if someone paid for them. Balian bargained for time and for the destitute. The patriarch and wealthy citizens gathered treasure to redeem as many as they could. On October 2, 1187, Jerusalem capitulated. There was no general massacre. Columns of residents filed out under guard, some ransomed, some enslaved when money ran out, some freed by Saladin's officers on their own charity. The Sultan entered the city quietly, ordered the cross removed from the Dome of the Rock, and purified the Haram al-Sharif. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre remained a church. Pilgrims, under treaty, would return again in years to come. News of Jerusalem's fall struck Europe like a funeral bell. Letters raced to Rome, to Paris, to the Empire. Pulpits shook. Kings stared at maps and vows. The West had lost the city it had crossed continents to seize. But the story was not finished. A king from England with a lion on his shield, a cunning marquis in Tyre, a German emperor whose death would turn legend, and a sultan who preferred pragmatism to pride were about to write the next act. Hattin had not simply delivered victory to Saladin. It had summoned the Third Crusade. The shores of the Levant would fill again with fleets and camps, and the wars of Richard and Saladin would carve a legend that still glows in memory. Fierce, flawed, and unforgettable.